Good morning, Nigeria. Welcome to another segment of Newspaper Review. I am Cassie Tony, and I'll be taking you through this segment. First, we'll start with The Guardian. Boldly written, ADC on brink of 2027 exclusion as court battles. The client draw near. You get that on page 6 of the newspaper. Borno, Benue top NBS records of 3.3 million IDPs across 14 states. You get it on page 3 of the newspaper. Gili airstrike targeted terrorist supply routes, not civilians, says federal government. You get it on page 3 of the newspaper. Tinubu's reforms pushed Nigeria's revenue to 3.6 trillion naira monthly, says NRS boss. You get that on page 3 of the newspaper. Still in the same newspaper at the bottom. Rising LPG prices, Middle East crisis threaten Nigeria's cooking gas market. You get that on page 15 of the newspaper. Still in the same newspaper. IMF downgrades Nigeria's GDP outlook, warns of rising risks. You get that on page 15 of the newspaper. Away from that newspaper to the blueprint, boldly written. Unveiling of NRS corporate headquarters. Tinubu says our revenue system will reward enterprise, support growth. You get it on page 8 of the newspaper. Court grants el-rufai bill. You get it on page 15 of the newspaper. With Dangote refinery, Nigeria emerges net petrol exporter. You get it on page 21 of the newspaper. ADC ratifies Mark Arekbeshola others as NWC members. At the bottom of the newspaper, Gili market airstrike based on credible intelligence, federal government clarify. You get that on page 8 of the newspaper. Away from that newspaper to the Nigerian Tribune, boldly written, ADC won't surrender to tyranny. Coming from David Mark. You get it on page 3 of the newspaper. Olubadan, Ajimobi, others deny plot to impeach Makinde. You get it on page 21 of the newspaper. Supreme Court orders accelerated hearing in PDP APC leadership crisis matter. You get it on page 3 of the newspaper. 2027. Ogun Muslim demands governorship slot. You get it on page 18 of the newspaper. Tinubu says no country can develop with inefficient tax system. You get it on page 3 of the newspaper. Federal government defense Air Force insists Borno airstrike was precision operation. You get it on page 21 of the newspaper. Away from that newspaper to the Daily Sun, boldly written. Insecurity, Akpabio fingers opposition. You get it on page 6 of the newspaper. Expresses optimism situation will end after 2027 polls. At the top of the newspaper, NCAA certifies Akanu Ibiam International Airport in Enugu. You get it on page 25 of the newspaper. IMF downgrades Nigeria's growth to 4.1%, cites inflation, spiking fertilizer prices, global risk. You get that on page 2 of the newspaper. At the bottom of the newspaper, Unijust student adopted. Igbo youth demand federal government's intervention. You get that on page 29 of the newspaper. US-Iran war triggers jet fuel crisis, pushes local efforts to 135,000 naira from 92,000 naira. You get that on page 25 of the newspaper. INEC chairman won't get away with illegalities coming from Atiku. You get that on page 6 of the newspaper. Away from that to the Vanguard, boldly written. In 2027, ADC dares court, INEC hosts convention. You get that on page 9 of the newspaper. On top of the newspaper, Gili airstrike, no innocent victims, coming from the defense minister. You get that on page 41 of the newspaper. Why Kwara is the best place to give birth, raise a child in Nigeria today. You get that on page 23 of the newspaper. Still in the same newspaper, UN's AO chief speaks at Vanguard Economic Discourse on agri sector. You get it on page 19 of the newspaper. Away from that newspaper to the leadership. Boldly written. Amid litigation, internal dispute, MAG-led ADC convention holds. You get it on page 4 of the newspaper. Amid litigation, internal dispute, MAG-led ADC holds convention. You get it on page 4 of the newspaper. On top of the newspaper, Tinubu says Nigeria's future won't be determined by chance. You get it on page 4 of the newspaper. Adedeji says without removal, petrol subsidy would have taken 72% of 2026 budget. You get it on page 21 of the newspaper. At the bottom of the newspaper, Niger Assembly passes bill to regulate scrap metal business. You get it on page 20 of the newspaper. Akpabio says bombings will stop after election victory. You get it on page 7 of the newspaper. Still in the same newspaper, police trust funds unveils housing, farming plans for officers. You get it on page 7 of the newspaper. El-rufai gets bill. Court adjourned till April 21st. You get it on page 17 of the newspaper. Away from that newspaper to the Daily Trust. Boldly written. ADC expels Nafiu Bala. Agbejedi unveils next move. You get that on page 3 and 4 of the newspaper. Still in the same newspaper, despite bill, el-rufai to remain in custody. You get that on page 5 of the newspaper. Tinubu says old tax laws impoverished Nigerians. You get that on page 3 of the newspaper. IMF cut Nigeria's growth rate from 4.4% to 4.1%. You get it on page 19. Federal Capital Territory community students trek 7 kilometers to school in Niger. You get it on page 16 of the newspaper. Away from that to the Punch, boldly written. ADC convention. Mark Atiku Arekbashola tackle Tinubu on hardship and security. You get it on page 2 of the newspaper. Federal government spends 75 billion naira on arms amid worsening insecurity. You get that on page 31 of the newspaper. Akpabio links terror attacks to plot against Tinubu. You get that on page 7 of the newspaper. Coup probe. Detained soldiers' wives demand justice. You get that on page 3 of the newspaper. Nigeria's debt hits 159.28 trillion naira on fresh loans. You get it on page 35 of the newspaper. FAAC deductions gulp 41% of 84 trillion naira revenue. You get it on page 35 of the newspaper. Security beef up at JAM exam centers coming from police. You get it on page 31 of the newspaper. Suspected cultists beat Lagos monarch's son to death. You get it on page 4 and 5 of the newspaper. Olubadan, Ajimobi's widow denied plot to impeach Makinde. You get it on page 34 of the newspaper. Away from that to the Daily Monitor, boldly written. IMF downgrades Nigeria's 2026 growth outlook to 41.1%. IMF downgrades Nigeria's 2026 outlook to 4.1%. You get that on page 6 of the newspaper. On top of the newspaper, Tinubu says strong, transparent revenue structure crucial to sustainable prosperity. You get that on page 4 of the newspaper. Supreme Court to hear PDP leadership appeals in April 2022. You get that on page 5 of the newspaper. Still in the same newspaper, Gili airstrike as it designated high-risk zone. Gili airstrike as it designated high-risk zone coming from the federal government. You get that on page 4 of the newspaper. Alleged fraud, el-rufai granted bail with tough conditions. You get that on page 4 of the newspaper. At the bottom of the newspaper, ADC will not bow to political pressure, says David Mark. Moving away from that newspaper to the Matrix, boldly written, ADC crisis, Mark-led coalition expels Bala Gombe, Leke Agbejide, orders. You get that on page 2 of the newspaper. On top of the newspaper, Tinubu commissions NRS new headquarters, says all tax laws made Nigerians poor. You get it on page 3 of the newspaper. Still in the same newspaper, presidency, Arakbashola Chue tackles over renewed hope, a scam comment. You get that on page 3 of the newspaper. Still in the same newspaper, Obi raises alarm on mounting death as IMF cuts Nigeria's growth projection. You get it on page 3 of the newspaper. Military smashes bandits, strongholds in Bauchi, rescues captives. You get it on page 9 of the newspaper. Nigeria, India seal $1 billion steel sector development park. You get that on page 9 of the newspaper. Fela becomes first African inducted into Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. You get that on page 23 of the newspaper. We've come to the end of this newspaper review. Many thanks for watching. I am Kasitoni. Do well to join us next time for more breaking news across Nigeria. A beautiful day to you.